Now, I'm thankful to be able to have the opportunity to speak to all of you today, and I just want to begin by addressing the elephant in the room. I know that you guys are not here to hear me speak, especially about the Bible. You came for the food, and you came to for the housing. I know that. I get it. I understand that that's a very important thing. It's understandable. I know you might not want to listen to the guy who's standing in front of you, who doesn't know, who doesn't understand your situation, has home, has money. But as with this ministry, you get the food. Because of that, you have to listen to me anyways for a bit as well. So don't worry, I don't plan to take up too much time, and I just want to, and I won't pretend like I know everything about you and I know your whole situation. I don't. You might be here for any unknown circumstance. You have your reasons. But I am going to talk about the Bible, and in this Bible, we are going to look at a story that talks about a man that you may have heard of, a man who wants to help you, and his name is Jesus, a man who does understand you and does understand the situation that you're in, and what it takes for him to help you is whether or not you understand him and the words that we will be reading with one another together now. So if you would look at the Bibles that you were handed out and open up to the book of John, imagining they've kind of been there, done this a little bit, you will be reading one of these stories together. A story that will tell us just who Jesus is. Helps us understand that. Now, beginning at verse 1, the little one there, it reads, "After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up in the mountains, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, 'Where are we to buy bread, so that these people may eat?' He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?' Jesus said, 'Have the people sit down.' Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, 'Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost.' So they gathered them up, and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, 'This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world.' Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself." Now, here we see Jesus. We see Jesus do an amazing miracle, an amazing thing. We see him do the impossible. Something that nobody else really could do. Makes a small amount of food. Feed 5,000. This is the man Jesus. But does that really tell us who he is? Why does he do this? Why can he do this? Well, that is what this story is going to be, or is telling us today. It is trying to get us to understand who Jesus is. And once we truly understand him, then we will believe and be with him. This passage is telling us that once we understand who Jesus is, then we will believe and be with him. So our story begins like a lot of other stories with a setting and kind of these situations and characters. We get introduced to all kind of these different groups of peoples, and we are told where they are and a little bit about why they're there. Our first and main character, Jesus, the big dog, he doesn't come out of nowhere. It was just talking to some religious leaders right before this story, and he was rebuking these religious leaders. And, I mean, just like all of us, if we get told that what we're doing is wrong, we might get a little angry. But these religious leaders didn't get just a little angry. They hated Jesus because of what he said. He told them that they were wrong, that they were sinful, that he was God, and what they said wasn't right. And they wanted him dead because of it. And because of this, Jesus, understandably, kind of leaves and goes to the other side of the sea. I mean, makes sense for all of us here. And it is here we are introduced to our first group. It is this crowd here. The crowd, these are just kind of like your average people of the day. The ones who were just going about their days, living their lives like everyone else. But then this Jesus came on the scene, and he started doing these crazy things. He started doing miracles and performing these crazy acts. All of these people, rich, poor, outcasts, popular, all of these just kind of normal people were seeing what Jesus has done, and now they're flocking to him. They were coming to Jesus because they saw what Jesus could do. In fact, Jesus has performed many great acts. Particularly, he healed a boy who was very sick and he wasn't even around him. He healed a paralyzed man who couldn't walk for most of his life. And the news was spreading like a wildfire around this Jesus who was nothing, and then all of a sudden has these huge crowds following him. He was at the start of his career, and he was already getting a crazy amount of followers. It's like blowing up out of nowhere. Kind of like some celebrities that we might know right now. Cardi B. Nowhere on the scene. Nobody knew who she was. Not from a famous family. Nobody knew. But now, you hear that name, you might snicker, you might laugh, but you know that name. Everyone's heard of her. And Jesus blew up. Everybody's hearing about him. Whatever he's doing seems pretty successful already. And I mean, it makes sense. When people do crazy awesome stuff, they get views, they get followers. Jesus was doing things people have never seen before. And honestly, not many people have seen since. If there was anyone to follow, if there was anybody who was getting attention, it was Jesus. And they saw it, and they wanted to be around him. And then it gives us to this other group, this kind of last group, the disciples. These were the people who followed Jesus and were specifically called by Jesus to learn from him. And Jesus goes up on this mountain, and then he sits down with them. See, these are the people Jesus prefers to be with, particularly because he's the ones that he chose specifically. And he chose specifically for a purpose. He wants them to learn from him. He wants them to grow because of what they're learning. They're seeing him on the daily. They're the ones who see him, hear him, listen to him. These are the people that you would think of, they're like those churchgoer do-gooders. Things that, they're the good people in society. They want to at least do the right thing. They seem to have something right. They're moral and they're just. And Jesus goes to his disciples. He's with them. The ones that he loves and spends his time with. And now, since we're introduced to these characters, And the reason why we're kind of introduced is to help us understand why they react the way they do to Jesus when what he does happens. You see, we can see who are the ones who understand Jesus, because we can understand them now, and who are the ones who believe in him. And with all this kind of context, the situational development, we kind of get into the problem now. The problem is coming. And it comes pretty quick. Jesus looks up from the mountain, and oh look, this huge crowd is coming right up to him. And we all think 5,000 people is a lot of people. Like, that's not a big deal. But you have to understand how outrageous this actually was for the time. Like, people didn't have cameras, microphones. These people, when they come to him, they're not seeing him the clearest. They're not hearing him the clearest. But that just goes to show how great Jesus' following was. The things he did, the things he claimed, were all so different. They were crazy, impossible. And craziest of all, maybe, he looks at these people and he asks, how are we going to feed them? How are we going to feed these people? I mean, if I see 5,000 people coming to me, I'm not going to think, how am I going to feed all these people? This is kind of like a bring your own lunch kind of party that you're coming to. Yeah, it's me being sinful. My immediate thought isn't to, how are we going to help these people and feed them as they're coming to me and talking to me and wanting my help? And Jesus does. He does want to feed these people. But the interesting fact in the story is that Jesus already knew how he was going to feed these people. In verse 6, the little 6 number, it says he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Now, the disciples see this enormous crowd and understandably think, no, we can't feed them. We're broke. We have no money. There's nothing that we could do. Getting food is expensive. Getting food for a lot of people is extremely expensive. And to put it in context, they say it's more than, even if we spent 200 days worth of work, it wouldn't even be enough to give them a little. That's how many people are here. A year of hard work, or 200 days of hard work, sorry. So about a year of hard work would probably be enough to give them a little. About a year of hard work. So think of your salary, or not your salary. Okay, screw that line. Think of all the people who can make money on a yearly basis, and they have this income, and they have this sustainability, yet they wouldn't even be able to feed this many people in 1 year's work. This crowd is huge, and the disciples understandably see the unrealistic idea of them feeding all of these people. All they have are 5 loaves and 2 fish from a random kid on the street, which wouldn't even be able to feed probably the disciples and Jesus, let alone all of these people. We understand that this situation is impossible. We can understand the disciples' reaction to this question, because it's impossible. Jesus was testing them. Do my disciples understand who I am? And the funny part about all this is the disciples were with Jesus every step of the way. They saw him heal. They saw him perform miracles. They saw him do the impossible quite a bit, quite a few times. Yet they still didn't think he could do it again. It'd be like you're playing ball in the street with some friends, and LeBron James walks up to you. He asks to play on your team, but then he says, you know what? I think just you and me are enough. We could do 5v2, just the two of us. And you start doubting that you can win because you're like, whoa, 2 versus 5? Like, that's a little much. But it's because you're not looking. Like, this is LeBron James. He's probably going to be dunking on every one of these people. He probably doesn't even need you there. You forgot who LeBron James is, but if you remember, then you would have been all for it. In the same way, if these disciples understood who Jesus is and what he could do, then they would have seen what Jesus has done coming miles away. But they didn't. They either forgot, they didn't understand Jesus in the first place. So we have these disciples who don't fully understand, and this crowd who is following Jesus just because of the cool things he does. And then we have Jesus again. Jesus is prepared for this. He knew what he was going to do. He tells the disciples to gather the people into groups, sit them down in the grass, and then they can, and this is where they find out how many exactly are, well, just 5,000 men it says, so it could be way more than that, because it's not including women and children. But either way, the odds are not looking good. That just makes it worse. And Jesus just cracks his knuckles, takes the fish and loaves, and gives thanks to the Father for what they have. Starts breaking them into pieces. He starts giving them to his disciples to pass out. Like a modern day Gordon Ramsay or Bobby Flay, they start dishing it out. Kind of like what we did here at the ministry today. Had food and we gave it out. But the thing is, the fish and the bread, it didn't stop. It kept coming, and it kept coming, and it kept coming. Everyone was getting their meal, and not just a small meal that wasn't satisfying, which I'm sure everyone can understand what it means to just have a little to eat. But no, these people were satisfied, the text says. They had their fill. They couldn't even eat anymore. And then Jesus said, to make it even crazier, go gather up the leftovers. And they gathered them in baskets, and they filled up 12 baskets of food. See, not only was Jesus able to feed all of these people, but they had so much food left over. And yes, I know, this sounds impossible. I know this sounds unreal. It's just a story. But I mean, it's kind of the point. What Jesus did was impossible for us. None of these people understand it, but it makes what the crowd's next, their actions next, understandable. So if you saw somebody perform such a great thing before you, you'd be amazed. You'd probably want to make them your leader. You would want to follow this person to the ends of the earth. Because if he could feed people miraculously, then surely he can do other great things as well. They're not following him for him. They're following him for themselves. The crowd calls him this prophet who is to come into the world. Which is strange, I know, what it even is a prophet. When we think of prophets, we think of fortune tellers who predict the future, all the mysterious stuff. But they're more like people who just tell others about what God's word says. And in this instance, it makes sense that these people call him a prophet. The Bible is a big book, and it's filled with many stories over thousands of years. And Jesus comes way later in this story of this whole book. He comes way later. As you can see, all this before. The people were given promises back then that God would send a prophet, a king, who would lead the people into this great kingdom of God, where the earthly rulers wouldn't have the power of authority, but God, the righteous and holy one, would. A God who loves his people, a God who saves his people. And that is why the crowd wanted to make him king. If this is the one promised from so long ago, then surely he's the one who will be king, and we're gonna make him king. And if you were just to kind of leave it off there, you would think that Jesus does become king next. That he leads these people well. He performs these miracles and miracles for the people. No one goes hungry again, and peace comes to the world. That's not what happens. Jesus instead leaves them. Not because he was tired, not because he needed some space, not because he was done, but he did it because the crowd wanted to make him king. And that's not what Jesus wanted. That's not what Jesus was going for. Instead, he ends up on this mountain that he was on in the beginning of the story. But there's something different about this time. Did you notice it? Can you see what's different about Jesus being on the mountain this time? Now, he is on the mountain, alone. No disciples. He's by himself. And I think the reason why he does this is because no one understood. No one understood who Jesus was. No one understood what Jesus came to do. The Jewish leaders wants him dead. The crowd wants him as king, but in the wrong way. And the disciples, who should have known, didn't even believe that he could feed these people coming. None of them understood. None of them got it. And this just leads me to ask, do you get it? Do you get who Jesus is? Do you understand? Do you truly believe? Well, if you were to keep reading through the book of John, which is where this story is, like we can see that the story is, closer to the end, you'll come across a section that explains why Jesus performs signs and miracles and wonders. And the reason is to show everyone that he is not just a man like you and me. He is God. He is God who has come into the world to save his people. He came to help them. As we can see by here, this passage, he helped them by providing them with food. This was a great sign, a miracle. But Jesus isn't just out here to save us from hunger. He is here to save us from sin. He would perform the greatest of signs, greater than just this feeding of 5,000 people, by dying on the cross. And when he does this by the will of the Father, he once again is alone. And even the Father turns away from him. But the sad part about Jesus being on the mountain alone, being there by himself, is because Jesus isn't lonely, but we should be there with him. We must be there with him. That is where we need to be. We must understand who he is and get with Jesus. Because when Jesus dies, 3 days later, he is raised from the grave. He doesn't satisfy just our stomachs, but saves our souls. Jesus isn't alone anymore. And in fact, he is reigning on his throne in heaven. He is a king. He is the prophet. Not put up by this crowd, but put up by God himself. Perfect. Because of what he did on the cross. And just as he wanted to help this crowd of people with their hunger, he wants to help you with your hunger, but also your sin. Sin, the things that we do against God, the troubles that we have, things that we do wrong against one another. This is what Jesus wants to save us from. He can. If you understand who he is and believe in him, he will help you. He will save you. But he will save you. And it's funny because we see these kind of three groups of people here. We see the Jews who just can constantly contend with Jesus. The crowds who just want to use Jesus for their own gain. And we see the disciples who are with him, but don't fully get it. If you fall into any of these categories, understand Jesus. Understand who he is fully and believe in him. Because although Jesus may have been alone at the end of this passage, he still continues to do his work for them. And he saves people so that they can do as Jesus did. I mean, we're sitting here right now because there are people who care about you. The people who serve in this ministry, they care enough to give you a place to eat and stay and provide these things for you. And they know, and they care even more about you because they don't only provide that meal and that place of lodging, but because they provide a time like this, where you get to hear about Jesus. This, my friends, is what Jesus came into the world to do. Save people. So let's understand who he is fully. Let's believe in him. You can. Let's finish by praying together.